All right, welcome back for another week of the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association podcast. Jack and I are here together in person this week, recording from the McCall Library recording studio. So if things go off the rails, it's probably because we've never done this in-person thing together, and we've already been here 30 minutes just trying to figure out how to hook up microphones. So, it'll be what it'll be. This week we've got a hopefully shorter but great episode talking about rainstorms, closing some things. The Fish and Wildlife Service is on a tear around endangered species updates and rule posting, and so we're going to talk about the newest one. Grizzly bear rule is out, and we've had a little time to digest it and what that's going to mean. Idaho Department of Lands and their fire budget, that should be a fun conversation. And finally, there's some data out that I think confirms something some of us knew, that hatcheries may not be the solution to dwindling fish numbers.
Yep. And then finally, we got a podcast interview with Justin Meuse from the Wilderness Society. He came on to talk about the Congressional Review Act. Justin's a super smart guy. He works on federal policy and government affairs for TWS. He's kind of been on the ground floor with the CRA. He's got a lot of insight into the complexities and the nuances of that piece of legislation and, using it for resource management plans. There's some real implications for permit holders and anyone that likes to use land. So, definitely worth a listen and hopefully get something out of it.
But before we get to any of that, first, it is member renewal season here at IOGA. So if you're an existing member of IOGA, outfitter, a guide, associate, business member, associate member, now is the time to renew. So you can go to IOGA.org and you can find the thing to renew up there. You also should have received probably 12 emails from Hardy at this point. And if you're not a member, now is a great time to join because your support will help us for the full year in our efforts to advocate for public lands, wild places, healthy resources, access, and a vibrant outfitting community. These episodes are also brought to you and supported by our annual sponsors. And this week, our main supporter is Air. So one of the world's best raft manufacturers and inflatable manufacturers, and they are right here in Idaho. So if you're an outfitter out there or just anybody looking for a new raft, you should definitely check them out.
Awesome. Gotta love an Idaho business. First up on our updates for this week, if you've been in the Frank Church at all, you've probably noticed there's been some big rainstorms. We've seen quite a few blowouts. Most notably, the Flying Bees runway had a blowout come down on part of the runway. So that's closed to the public. It sounds like commercial air operators are still getting in and out, although with a shortened takeoff and landing there. Maybe more importantly, Highway 21 looks pretty seriously closed. There's a big landslide that came down kind of in that spot that burned a few years ago, west of Banner Summit. ITD has said it could take them a week, or maybe even more, to clear that. So keep your eyes peeled on that. If you got to go from McCall or Cascade-to-Stanley, or even Boise-to-Stanley, recommend finding an alternate route.
Yeah, you Main Salmon folks, that south shuttle doesn't look like the way to go these days, unless you want to do the dirt road cut across. So Montana, it might be for you.
Yep. And if you're going through Montana, make sure you brush up on the DOT regs because people have been getting in trouble for those.
Yep, and we do have a guide on the website, IOGA.org. Right there in the top, you can find our guide to DOT compliance for outfitters. So check that sucker out. Moving on, the Fish and Wildlife Service dropped another ESA final rule. So this is not something we can comment on or there's really any ability to do anything about other than just understand it and understand how it's going to impact outfitters. So a couple days ago, on July 21st, Fish and Wildlife Service finalized a rule that changes how they decide when to exclude land from the Endangered Species Act critical habitat designations. It's effective starting August 20th. Quick background, Section 4B2 of the ESA has always let the Secretary carve out specific areas from critical habitat designation if the economic or other cost outweigh the conservation benefit, as long as it won't drive the species extinct. But how the agency actually does that weighing has flip-flopped for decades, starting back, in 2016 and then 2020 and then 2022. And then again, we're seeing some things now. So this is another example of kind of that as we shift administrations, the pendulum back and forth on how things are happening, which in almost every case of that going on, just creates inconsistency and lack of reliability and understanding for people's businesses and permits and everything else. But here we are. So why this matters for us. Permittees and leasees on federal land are now explicitly named parties whose input can trigger a formal exclusion analysis if they present what the rule calls credible information, in quotes, of real impact. And that's talking about like financial impact on your business if some area is designated as critical habitat. And another piece of this is that Fish and Wildlife Service is going to be giving more weight to that kind of outside on the ground data, not just biological data. And they have to really incorporate that in and take a higher evaluation of it unless they have evidence to rebut it or to basically rebut it. Third, once Fish and Wildlife Service own analysis says exclusion benefits outweigh inclusion benefits, the rule says they shall exclude, which is a firmer commitment than before. They had a lot more leeway on what to do when they did that sort of economic versus the biological benefits economic analysis. They had a bit more freedom, and this is really aiming towards, no, you will exclude it. So this is not going to touch things that are already in place and all those things. It does not go backwards. It only applies going forwards to future critical habitat proposals or consultations and evaluations. So the main takeaway for outfitters, if a critical habitat proposal ever overlaps your operating area, this rule gives you and us as IOGA a clear agency acknowledged path to show that, during the comment periods and that consultation period, we can come forward and demonstrate how, designation could negatively impact one's business or the industry economically, and they would have to incorporate that into their review. Now, there are some really good things for outfitters in that. We've had some issues in the past where, critical habitat designation maybe was really broad and areas were incorporated. There wasn't actual great evidence that the critters were even there, and it could have really negative impacts on somebody's outfitting operation or whatever, or put big stipulations or restrictions on that. Depending on your perspective, that can, lightening that up can be great. This is also going to apply to everyone else who goes through this process. So we're talking about logging, mining, your consumptive industries as well. And reading it personally, that's kind of where I think this is really aimed at. So will there be some benefits for outfitters in our operations? Absolutely. But, as you think about this bigger picture, this certainly opens the door and I think creates more ability for mining operations and probably some logging operations to make economic arguments around critical habitat designation.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but I think this is only for Fish and Wildlife, right? It doesn't apply to NOAA Fisheries.
Correct.
So, this won't have an impact for salmon and steelhead or any of our anadromous species in Idaho right now. It's always possible NOAA Fisheries could create their own version of this rule, but it seems like it's land-based for now. So just so I can understand this better, can you give me an example of how this might affect, like, let's say a hunt outfitter that wants to permit a new operating area that has some wolverine habitat in the area?
Yeah, I think that one here in Idaho is a really good example, right? Because there's a lot of potential critical habitat for wolverines, at least sort of theoretically. And what, in that consultation process or in that process, the outfitter would, as a permittee, specifically being called out permittee, be able to submit information or evidence that if, a certain area is labeled critical habitat and there's restrictions around their ability to operate there, they can demonstrate the negative economic impact that would have on their business. If they can't go there, they can't operate there certain times of the year or whatever, that it maybe would make their entire operation not viable or something. And that review process would have to take that into account and weigh it with pretty heavy amount of weight at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that is that one. Again, it's a final rule, so it sort of is what it is. Our role now is, the comment period is past. The ability to change it is past, at least during this administration. I think the main thing for us to do is to understand it and understand, where that becomes an opportunity for outfitters to, advocate for their businesses in the industry, and also to understand where that could be used for things that maybe we're a little less supportive of.
Yep. All right. One thing I was thinking about when you were talking about that, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but we should really be aware of, the regulatory backlash that might come out of some of these changes, not just this one, but, some of the changes around the definition of harm, around the grizzly bear thing, we'll talk about in a second. Just something to, as an outfitter, to be aware of, that, like, you might get comfortable operating under a certain set of rules, and, the next administration might come in and reverse them, change them significantly. So, just pay attention. Talk to your permit administrator.
Yeah, this one has literally ping-ponged since the Obama administration. Yeah. Almost every single administration change, to some extent.
Nice. All right. Next up, we talked a little bit last week about the proposed changes for grizzly bear management. We now have a little more clarity on the details, and Eric and Aaron went over this on the outfitter brief, so if you're listening to that podcast as well, this will be review. But if you're not, here's what you should know. So Doug Burgum, along with the governors of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, had a press conference on July 14th. A few days later, Fish and Wildlife published their revised proposal in the Federal Register on July 17th. So that'll have a 30-day comment period that's open from then until August 17th. What this does is it amends the species-specific regulation for grizzly bears to give states kind of a tiered path to management authority when recovery benchmarks are met or exceeded. So there's Tier 1 and Tier 2. The states or the tribes that want to take over management have to sign a memorandum of understanding with the federal government, basically laying out, the things that they're going to do to manage these bears. And then, as the bears move through the process, they can get more and more state management. Once they get those MOUs signed, they kind of have their plans in place. It's important to say what this doesn't do. So it does not delist the grizzly bear, which is still threatened, not endangered, but threatened in the lower 48. It doesn't authorize a hunting season, and they've been very clear about that. And this pretty much applies to kind of the bears in the Northern Rockies, Greater Yellowstone area. So it doesn't touch experimental populations in the Bitterroot or the Cascades. Really what this does, it's a fairly, I think it's going to have big impacts, but it is a gradual handing over of management authority to the states, which is something the states have wanted for a long time. It'll I think, allow for more flexibility on the ground, maybe better science-based management. I think ultimately more community buy-in as well. So,
I think that's right. My understanding of it is at least in the short to medium term, this should mean pretty small to very, very little actual change. Yeah. It is going to give states some more authority and management in the long term once they jump through a bunch of hoops, and assuming that sort of that local bear population in their state is meeting recovery goals and those kinds of things. I think it ultimately, one of the main drivers here is it's going to give the state a little bit more capacity to deal with problem bears, due to depredation or ones that are causing issues with humans and those kinds of things, without having to spend a ton of time and effort, jump through a bunch of hoops with the feds to end up at the same place. That, as I read it, that's kind of one of the main things that I'm going to see here. It doesn't touch experimental populations. So what that means is, like the Bitterroot, Cascades, as you mentioned, those are places where bears haven't been specifically reintroduced. They may have just roamed in there. So if they haven't been reintroduced there, this is not it doesn't affect those populations. It's for the places where bears have been really focused in or reintroduced and those kinds of things. Yeah,
and it's worth noting, experimental populations typically don't have the same ESA protections because they are experimental. It's kind of a weird middle ground that the agencies use for a lot more flexibility in management.
I also think one of the positives here is it seems like there is a trend with sort of the federal government to think about grizzly bears as this sort of monoculture and create these goals everywhere. And that's just, one, I don't think super realistic, and two, doesn't recognize that these really are distinct, unique populations in different places. And this will drive sort of, I think, the management towards that, where we're focused in on the population health of a certain specific area and population health of that certain specific area, instead of saying, we're not meeting overall goals across 5 states because we haven't got the bear population up in all 5, even if we have more bears than they actually want in some areas, some specific areas. So again, I'm not a biologist, but reading other really smart people as they talk about this is kind of the general framing that we're picking up from people that I tend to trust on this.
Yeah, so bottom line on this, like I said, there's a comment period open from now until August 17th through Fish and Wildlife. We'll be putting together comments from IOGA, and definitely want to hear from you all on this, how you feel about this change, how grizzly bears have affected or might affect your operation in the future. Having that on the ground perspective is extremely valuable to the agencies as they're considering this change.
I also think as we think about what's going to impact outfitters specifically and reading through this, and again, it's pretty long and pretty complicated, and we're still probably getting our heads around it and starting to work on our our comments on this. But there is some specific pieces in there around incidental take related to trapping that could open the door for more predator trapping in places, because it will reduce the conflict with incidental take on grizzly bears. But even there, the hoops that have to be jumped through, the long-term trends, like, it is not going to open the door for trapping overnight or even in the near future, I would say. But it does open the door maybe for more conversations around trapping in, like, maybe denning season or things like that in grizzly bear terrain for wolves and predators. So that to me, as I think about what's going to be a real direct impact on outfitters, that one actually seems like maybe the most, but it's still small and it's still probably a long way out. All right, let's move on to, we are in fire season, right? We all know it. Some of you are really living in the smoke, and some of us are living in a little less smoke, at least for today. But reporting's come out. Idaho Department of Lands has already spent $20 million on the fire budget so far, according to what the legislature transferred, as well as interagency transfers, and that leaves them with around $17 million for the rest of the summer. And, I'm not a firefighter, but it feels like we're pretty early in the old fire season to be through more than half the budget. It's worth noting that when money runs out, as it seems like it probably will, that doesn't mean that IDL will just stop fighting fires. Instead, they'll start paying for things with something called a deficiency warrant, which is a government for a government agency is like using a credit card. Land Board discussed raising the forest fire protection tax, which is a fee paid by landowners of forested acreage to fund wildfire protection, but they didn't do it. They likely will have to in the future, but wanted more information. So, cool. That's good news.
Yep. Put out your campfires.
Yeah.
Watch those trailer chains.
Dude, the trailer chains thing is real. It doesn't sound like it would be. I used to believe that's a myth. But then in Southern Oregon, I saw numerous forest fires get started that way. So, put out your fires, watch your cable chains. Don't be that person. Let's all band together here and try and have a smoke-free summer as much as possible.
Yep. Okay, next up, we have a pretty big research study out from fish biologists at IDFG, Oregon, Washington, looking at the effectiveness of the anadromous fish hatchery system. So they went and looked at, the survival rates, the number of smolts produced, and the number of adults returning to those hatcheries at the key hatcheries across the Snake River Basin that are producing salmon and steelhead. It's a pretty in-depth study, and they don't prescribe any real solutions right now, but I would say that the core takeaway from the study is that the hatchery system is not working. It is inadequate to provide the number of adult fish that not only was promised, but that we actually need to run our sport fishery. And I'll just read this quote from the executive summary of the report. So it says, if the smolt to adult returns remain similar to that observed in the recent past, hatchery programs need to increase smolt production by 300 to 1,200%. So that's a 300 to 1,200% increase. Finally, they lowered the return goal to implementing a targeted sport fishery and found that less than half of the hatcheries could reliably support a minimal recreation fishery under current survival rates, and that the 3 programs may not support a fishery even with substantial production increases. Their conclusion, our analysis demonstrates that goals cannot be achieved under current conditions with the existing hatchery system. It's kind of a bombshell, in my opinion. Something we've been talking about for a little bit with the Lower Snake Compensation Plan, which are the federally funded hatcheries. But this study looked at both, those Lower Snake Comp Plan hatcheries and also the hatcheries that Idaho Power operates. I think we need to understand that when the dams went in on the Lower Snake as well as in Hell's Canyon, there was a promise from these agencies that they would mitigate the loss of anadromous fish in place and in kind by building these hatcheries to produce more fish to replace the wild fish that were being lost. And there's a lot of people out there that say, well, you can't, wild fish and a hatchery fish are very different. You can't replace the ecosystem services. But even if you disregard those arguments, like, we are not meeting the hatchery goals that were promised in the first place, and we need more mitigation than we thought we did. So what this says to me is that, the hatchery managers are doing their job the best they can. They're producing a bunch of smolts. Their survival rates before they release the fish are pretty good. The survival rates from the release down to the dams are pretty good. Really, the problem is in the hydro system, which is something we already know, but it's interesting to see this replicated with hatchery fish as well. We're also spending a ton of money on this program. We really needed to work to keep our sport fishery going right now. And so, Eric, what do you think?
I mean, my general takeaway from this was essentially saying it doesn't matter how many fish come out of the hatchery, like how many smolts we produce. If they can't get to the ocean and back from the ocean without dying, there is no solve this with making more fish. Like that is not a solution to the problem. You cannot do enough. You cannot create enough fish up at this upper end in the smolt level to get the number of adults that you want to have back here. Because arguably, at least in large part, a bunch of the dams and where they die off go on the way down or get hammered by predators or all of the things. When all those things add up, it just doesn't work.
Yep.
So, at least as things sit today.
Yeah. I think we need to seriously reevaluate, how we operate the hydro system, more spill. And I think this is a key part in looking at, replacing those dams and restoring our wild runs, is understanding how the hatchery system really just does not provide what it's supposed to do.
I mean, it provides what it's supposed to do as far as, like, they do their job. They make the fishies. Yeah. But the problem is that the fishies don't get back here.
Right.
in the numbers that we want.
Yeah. I mean, no one, like, at the end of the day, a fisherman doesn't care how many smolts are in the river if there's no adult fish coming back. Like, that's right. Really what matters to 99% of people that aren't, hatchery managers. Like, I don't know about you, but I've never gone out with the intention of, like, catching a salmon smolt to eat, right? Like, they're tiny little skinny guys.
Yeah, I don't really care how many smolts they put in the river. I care about how many of the adults get back, for sure. We've been talking recently about sort of the economics of hatcheries, and I was pretty interested. You quoted me a number, I think, recently on how much additional, like, building more capacity in hatcheries, what the cost per fish is to do that.
Yeah, so this is from a conversation I had with one of the, like, top guys at Fish and Wildlife that runs the Lower Snake Compensation Plan. So he kind of oversees the hatchery system. And he sent me, some budget items that they've been looking at. There's kind of two things. There's deferred maintenance, which was like fixing some of the things that are currently, wearing out or getting old or broken in the hatcheries. And then there was new capital projects that they were looking at to increase production. So I don't have the number off the top of my head for the deferred maintenance, but I think it was around $140 million. Then their capital projects that they were looking at, they were projecting that they'd spend about $248 million on those capital projects. I mean, if they get the money. And that was going to produce about 48,000 fish and some change. So when you do the math on that, it works out to about $5,000 per adult fish, which is, I mean, frankly, that's an insane number to be asking for. Like no serious appropriator is going to give you that much money to produce that many fish. And like, I don't know how we can look at that and not say that, you know, instead of subsidizing these fish to the tune of thousands of dollars per fish, like we would be much better off in, you know, going to the hydro system, operating those dams, you know, to get more fish down the river, even looking at replacing those dams. I think you can make a real argument that you would produce many, many more fish just by doing that per dollar, right? So, yeah, this has to be part of the conversation going forward. I think our policymakers need to understand, like, the amount of money that we're throwing into this system just to, you know, send hatchery smolts to die in the hydro system. It doesn't make any sense. So, and this is taxpayers and Northwest ratepayers are paying for all of this. So if you are worried about your energy bill, you know, this is one place to look.
Yeah. I think on that note, it's worth pointing out that Jack is going to be in Lewiston and Clarkston here coming up with Idaho Rivers United, talking about the new report they have on the lower snake economic impact. Jack, anything you want to share on that one?
Yeah, so we'll be in Lewiston, I believe, at Lewis and Clark State College on the 3rd, and then we'll be at the Red Line Golf Club in Clarkston on the 5th. And, you know, IRU's got this study that they did that kind of looks at dam removal projects across the country. It looks at economic conditions in kind of the Lewis and Clark Valley and Nez Perce and Asotin counties. And the results of that they're not crazy. They pretty much found that, you know, Nez Perce and Asotin counties have kind of lagged behind the rest of the region economically. Population growth has been slow. And then looking at, you know, the economy of the area, they forecasted that dam removal really wouldn't affect the economy in those counties. The sectors that rely on the dams are actually quite small. And dam removal in other places has been, you know, pretty much business as usual from an economic standpoint. You can look at a chart and there's kind of no difference in the before and after in terms of economic growth, population growth, stuff like that. So we'll be there to talk about it. The thing that I think most interested in talking about is the economic opportunity that, you know, restoring an outdoor recreational resource that is the lower snake, as well as the upstream tributaries like the Hell's Canyon salmon and Clearwater as anadromous fisheries. The opportunity that presents for that area, you know, Lewiston and Clarkston could become this incredible hub of outdoor recreation more than it already is. If we restored 140 miles of free-flowing river downstream of the area and then brought salmon back upstream of the area. So if folks are around in Lewiston, Clarkston, come check it out. I think there's more details on IRU's website. Hopefully it'll be a good conversation. Folks can learn a bit more about their future.
Awesome. Well, yeah, go by, see Jack, say hi, listen, learn. I think that the economics of this are a big part of the conversation. Like, we all want more fish upstream, but, you know, politics is often a conversation around money, and so we need to have conversations around the economics of this to get that direction going. So definitely worth checking out. All right, we're going to go to our interview. Jack, you want to prep anybody for what's coming here?
You know, we do get into the weeds a little bit, and Justin definitely knows his stuff, so if you're interested in the CRA, if you're worried about the effects it might have on your permit, especially with the lawsuit in Oregon that we talk about a bit, definitely pay attention, maybe take some notes. Just think about how, you know, your permit might be vulnerable in this space. So,
yeah, I mean, this is definitely, we talked about it, I think, at the annual meeting, and we said, you know, this is the thing that might be nothing, or it might be the end of the industry.
Yeah.
And not to say we were right, but it's, you know, things are trending in the exact direction we hoped they wouldn't, and this is a really good conversation. I think grounds it, maybe hopefully, like, allows the alarmists like myself to sleep a little bit better at night on this one, while also, I think, still raising awareness to some of the complexities and some of the concerns that we should all have a little bit. So check it out, enjoy, and here's the interview with Justin. The Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association relies on the support of our members, but especially our Dollars for Outdoors supporters who go above and beyond. Outfitters like Cascade Raft and Kayak, Mile High Outfitters, McGowan Outfitters, White Cloud Outfitters, Bear Valley, Rapid River Outfitters, Soar Northwest, Bighorn Outfitting, Mystic Saddle Ranch, and Table Mountain.
Also, our Dollar for Salmon supporters, their money goes specifically to support our work advocating for anadromous fish recovery, looking into the hatchery system, the work we're doing around that, going to Lewiston and everything. So big shout out to Rapid River, SNS, Canyons, Solitude, and Salmon River Drifters. You guys rock. All right, Justin Meuse, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jack. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. Real quick for our audience, you mind introducing yourself and kind of what you do?
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Justin Meuse. I work for the Wilderness Society on our government relations team. So a lot of what I do is work with other organizations in the conservation movement and with the Wilderness Society's many colleagues and partners across the country to advocate for conservation solutions to protect our nation's federal public lands. I advocate with Congress and with the administration, and prior to working at the Wilderness Society, I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years.
Okay, awesome. Cool, so you've been in DC for quite a while then. That's cool. You get to be involved with a lot of very interesting things, I would imagine.
Yeah, pretty interesting stuff, for sure.
So you've been kind of at the center of the conversation around the Congressional View Act. This is something we've been talking about with our members, I think, for almost a year now. But it's pretty in the weeds, and you never know who's paying attention or not. So, maybe let's start from the basics. What is the CRA, the Congressional Review Act, and what has Congress been doing with it over the last few months?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Congressional Review Act was enacted into law back in 1996. So folks who've been following politics for a long time may remember that back in 1995, there was sort of a groundswell of conservatives who came into Congress, led by folks like Newt Gingrich and John Boehner, who came up with a legislative document called the Contract with America. And that included an opportunity for Congress to essentially veto actions taken by the executive branch. And what they ended up coming up with was the Congressional Review Act, which gives Congress the opportunity to overturn actions taken by the executive, whether it's from an agency like the Bureau of Land Management or a department like the Department of the Interior, on land management decisions, or something dealing with small business administration, or any other executive agency or department. What it allows Congress to do is, within 60 Senate session days of the administration finalizing a new rule or action, Congress has the opportunity to disapprove that by passing through both the House of Representatives and the Senate a joint resolution of disapproval to nullify the rule. What separates this from typical legislation that goes through the legislative process is it doesn't need 60 votes in the Senate. So you often hear about how most things that go through Congress need 60 votes to pass through the Senate. A resolution of disapproval targeting a rule only needs 50 votes within a time frame. So I mentioned 60 Senate session days earlier. So when the agency issues that rule, then Congress can act quickly within those 60 Senate session days to nullify that rule with just 50 votes in the Senate. So that process was enacted into law back in 1996. It was used pretty sparingly until 2017. In fact, the first time it was used was in the year 2001 when the Congress that came into power in 2001 and President Bush ended up nullifying a rule that was finalized in the final days of the Clinton administration dealing with ergonomics. And then it was next used by the Trump administration to target a series of actions taken by the Obama administration at the end of 2016. This Congress, we've seen the current Congress and the administration. So that's another particularity of the CRA is once it passes both chambers of Congress, it needs to be signed into law by the president. So you kind of need to have all three. You need to have all three levers of power in order to enact these types of things. We saw a lot of it in the first Trump administration in the first few months. But then this Congress, we saw the administration and Congress work together to target rules that were older than 60 Senate session days. They came up with new and novel ways to target actions taken by the Biden administration, longer ago than is typically allowed using the Congressional Review Act.
Are they just redefining what a day is, basically? Are they saying like a day is not a temporal day, but maybe just a legislative construction?
So what they were doing is they were targeting things that the Biden administration didn't even think were rules. So things that they didn't even submit to Congress. So that 60 Senate session day clock never started because certain things weren't submitted to Congress. And they were things like Bureau of Land Management land use plans, which administrations from both parties didn't view as rules until Congress and the administration last year decided that they were.
Okay. Yeah, so that's kind of what I want to dive into is the BLM management plans. Obviously, a lot of our members are operating on BLM lands, and so there's some real relevance to them there. So why, I guess, first question is why haven't those plans been submitted to Congress in the past, right? So if they're able to go use the CRA on them now, does that mean they should have been submitted? Are we changing the definition? What's going on here?
Yeah, that's a really important question. So the Congressional Review Act dictates that Administrative Procedure Act rules with a notice and comment period must be submitted to both chambers of Congress and to the Comptroller General, who's the executive at the Government Accountability Office. Land use plans, so resource management plans under the Bureau of Land Management. There's an integrated activity plan in Alaska for the Western Arctic. There's a coastal plain leasing program in the Arctic that also counts as a land use plan, and many other types of plans have never prior to this year been submitted to Congress. So the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, Obama, Trump 1, Biden never submitted any of those plans to Congress, and that's because they didn't think they had to. Ultimately, what happened this Congress is we had members of Congress who didn't like certain decisions made by the Biden administration, certain resource management plans that were finalized by that administration, ask the Government Accountability Office, which is this kind of independent watchdog within the legislative branch, are these resource management plans rules? And the GAO came back and said, they meet our definition for rules. That's our opinion. Congress ended up entering those opinions into the record and then used the CRA against them, despite when they had been finalized by the previous administration. So should they have submitted them to Congress? I think that's an open question, but I'll just stress that both parties, administrations of both parties, believed they didn't have to until this year.
Okay, so just to recap, so the Government Accountability Office rules that a plan can be considered a rule, the agency can then submit that rule slash plan to Congress, and then Congress has 60 days to disapprove of it, and then the president can sign it. So that's the general process that we're talking about here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the general process, and
Yeah.
there are a couple of different workarounds. The way that the Congressional Review Act is written is pretty imprecise. Like there's nothing in the text of the Congressional Review Act that takes into account what happens if the administration doesn't submit a rule to Congress. When does that 60 days start? And
Yep.
that's the problem. That's one of the problems that we're dealing with right now is what happens in those cases.
Yeah, because I would think, I think Idaho's got 21 BLM RMPs, not to mention all of our forest plans that
Yep.
I mean, I can't say for certain, but I would imagine none of them have ever been submitted to Congress, so they're kind of just sitting there. Um, okay,
Yeah.
so so once Congress disapproves and the president signs it, that RMP is then considered null and void, right? It's out the window, right?
It's out the window, yeah. And the way that the administration has interpreted the law is that when that happens, the previous resource management plan, in effect prior to the most recent one,
Hmm.
kind of takes effect.
Okay.
But one really complicated thing about the Congressional Review Act is not only does it delete the plan that's being targeted by the joint resolution of disapproval, but it also prohibits the agency from ever issuing a rule in the future or a plan in the future that is substantially the same. And there's a lot of debate about what substantially the same means. Does it mean exactly the same? Does it
Hmm.
mean any component part of that plan can't be replicated in the future? Like these resource management plans deal with a lot. Like they deal with special recreation permits. They deal with oil and gas leases. They deal with what's open and closed to timber production. So they're really multifaceted and deal with a lot of different things. They're a roadmap for how you can use this entire parcel of land. Like how does that provision apply is an open question.
Yeah, okay. That was going to be my next question. So, like, let's just take the Cottonwood RMP here in Idaho as an example. So, if you were, to go rescind that Cottonwood RMP, you couldn't. I guess maybe we're in uncharted waters here, but it's unclear whether or not you could come back and say, okay, you know, we fixed the one travel management portion that we didn't like in this section, but we're going to keep all of our grazing permits and our special recreation planning and all that stuff in this other section, and it's unclear whether or not you could actually do that. Is that what you're saying? Like, it's not clear whether it
Yeah,
has to be like a 50% change. It could be a 1% change. We don't know.
we don't know. We don't know.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
that's and it is not new and novel territory, and it's something where ultimately, at some point down the line, um, like a court will decide how
Yeah.
that substantially the same piece actually applies in practice.
Okay. Okay. You also, mentioned special recreation permits. So, I mean, as you know, most authorizations come out of the management plan, right? That's kind of how you prescribe what you're going to do with grazing, timber, recreation, on and on and on. So, when an
Yep.
RMP goes away and you revert to that previous RMP, I would imagine that it kind of throws some of those authorizations into chaos. Do we know how that's administrated yet? Has that been kind of tested at all?
It hasn't. It really hasn't. We've seen so far 7 land use plans be targeted by the Congressional Review Act, and we've seen the joint resolutions to delete all 7 of those land use plans or land management decisions get enacted into law. But we haven't seen any sort of like concrete impact for the folks who have authorizations under those plans to this point. Whether it's an oil or gas lease or a special recreation permit, like that hasn't borne out at this point. We have seen for a few of those, we have seen the administration issue like a new resource management plan or land use plan. We've seen that in the Arctic with the coastal plain leasing program in the Arctic Refuge, with the integrated activity plan in the Western Arctic, with the North Dakota resource management plan. They're working on a new one as well. But other than that, we haven't seen how exactly it all plays out for those authorization holders.
Yeah, and I guess to get back to what we were just talking about, I would imagine those plans, we don't know if those plans are legally valid yet either because we don't know if they're substantially similar. Or are they different enough?
Yeah, that's a great point too. We don't know. I know that the folks who are writing those plans and the folks in Congress who championed the joint resolutions to delete the Biden era plans are taking a very conservative understanding of how the CRA works. It just means to delete the exact plan that had been in place so that we can easily replace it. But that's not the read that we have. We're obviously very concerned. It could be much broader than that.
Okay. Another question, and this is maybe a basic one, but it's primarily been used on BLM plans, as far as I understand it. Is there anything to change the implications for forest plans? A lot of our members are operating on, Forest Service ground. Is there a difference there besides the name?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think that in terms of the criteria that the Government Accountability Office used to determine that resource management plans are, like under the BLM, are rules, it would be, it wouldn't be too difficult to say that, applying those same criteria to forest management plans would yield the same result. So if we had a member of Congress who hated a forest plan in, say, Washington State, they could take that forest plan, write a letter to the Government Accountability Office and say, apply your criteria to this forest plan and tell me what your opinion is on whether or not this is a rule pursuant to the CRA. Given what GAO has said about BLM land use plans, BLM resource management plans, it's very easy to imagine that they'd come back with the same sort of decision or opinion on forest plans that they did on RMPs. So I'd say for that reason, they are likely to be susceptible to the CRA as well.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I'm happy to get into it's basically, there are exceptions to the CRA that the GAO observes. One of them is if a rule is like an agency management or personnel decision rule, or if it's about like agency organization or procedure that doesn't substantially affect the rights or obligations of non-agency parties. Those are a couple of the things that might cause GAO to say, oh, this isn't a rule. But given the fact that these forest plans and RMPs deal with so many non-agency parties, it seems likely that they would decide that forest plans are rules pursuant to the CRA.
Yeah. Okay. This is maybe an aside, but just thinking about personnel and agency organization, do you think the CRA could be used, on let's say the current Forest Service reorganization?
That's a really good question. I think that what we're seeing with the types of decisions that are being targeted by the CRA, at first we started seeing these land use plans, then it's getting more granular. Like back in January, we saw the administration with Congress's backing target the public lands order that withdrew from mining interests, certain lands in the headwaters of the boundary waters, canoe and wilderness area. there's really nothing stopping the administration from submitting, even further order decisions to Congress and calling them rules and letting Congress use the CRA on them. So, a reorganization potentially, maybe in a different political landscape, a different Congress and administration might consider that a rule, but I don't think the GAO would decide that is that's a rule pursuant to the GAO. Just given that their three criteria include agency management and personnel as exceptions
Yeah.
from the CRA.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like if the easier way to do it would just be to have the administration, if you had a friendly administration that wanted to reverse that, they could just order it. So that was more just my own personal curiosity.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
so kind of back to where we were. Um, I think if I remember right, the CRA says that rules that aren't submitted to Congress, following this procedure that they're supposed to follow, uh, are not legally effective, right? They're not operative until they get submitted and go through the process. First of all, is that a correct understanding? And second of all, if that's true, for all these RMPs that are out there now, like the 21 we have in Idaho, is there a good argument you could make that they are not legally effective because they had not been submitted to Congress?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the CRA isn't quite as black and white as that.
Okay.
But the first line says, before a rule can take effect, the federal agency promulgating such rule shall submit to each House of Congress and the Comptroller General a report containing the rule, etc. So, an honest interpretation, in my view, of that first line is, it says before a rule can take effect, it must be submitted. So one could, very easily argue that if it wasn't submitted to Congress, then, is it in effect? That's an open question. And, the Congressional Review Act was enacted in 1996. We saw resource management plans well before that. I'm sure some of the 21 in Idaho were finalized before that. This argument really only applies to post 1996 plans,
Okay.
because anything that was finalized before that wouldn't be subject to this stipulation. But there is a real argument that all the ones that were finalized after 1996, because they weren't submitted to Congress and to the Comptroller General, may not be in effect right now. And there are a lot of questions that raises about all of the authorizations that have been issued pursuant to those plans in the time since.
Yeah, and there's a lawsuit that was just filed in Oregon that's kind of making that claim, right? Cascadia Wildlands v. Burgum. Are you kind of up to speed on that? I think.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting lawsuit out of Oregon, like you mentioned. Essentially, what they've done is they've identified two resource management plans in Oregon, the Northwestern and Coastal Oregon resource management plans, and they're arguing that those plans aren't in effect because they weren't submitted to Congress when they were finalized back over a decade ago. And because of that, authorizations issued pursuant to those plans, including a timber sale, are unlawful. So it's using that same argument that any plan that wasn't submitted to Congress pursuant to that first line of the CRA isn't in effect, and questioning the validity of any authorizations issued pursuant to it.
Yeah. So I mean, just based on kind of the conversation we've been having, it seems like if you had to crystal ball that, you would say that argument at least has some legs. Yeah.
Yeah. And when Congress started making this, kind of going down this path last year, this is something a lot of folks raised issues with. There was a really great letter signed by over 30 law professors who work across the West on land use planning, who warned about this. That this was one of the potential consequences of using the Congressional Review Act against land use plans. That it could have very far-reaching consequences if folks aren't careful. So now we're seeing that borne out in this suit. So very interested to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and yeah, I think a timber sale and an outfitting permit are different, but I think in the context of the CRA and of the RMP there, I don't see a lot of daylight between them, and like I don't think anyone would sue over outfitting permits necessarily. Like everyone loves outfitters, right? I say that
Yeah.
with some irony, but I think like having the idea of having the whole plan kind of declared you know, ineffective or not legal and having that pulled out from under you is something that's I think starting to keep me up at night and has definitely been keeping Eric up at night for a while. Um, yeah, so I guess maybe another question about that, stakeholders who are depending on the RMP stability, whether, outfitters, logging companies, don't, people like that. What do you think is kind of the exposure timeline here? Is this something that like could change right now for, your generic Idaho outfitter on BLM land or Forest Service land for that matter, I guess? Or is this something that's, maybe more of a structural risk that is kind of sitting in the background? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think it's more of a structural risk, to be honest. Like, I don't know what the timeline is for this suit or what the court's ultimately going to say, and I'm a little wary of speculating too much on how that'll go and what sort of ramifications it'll have for all authorizations under land use plans. But it does highlight that Congress really broke something here. Or potentially really broke something here by targeting land use plans with the CRA. It's called into question like all sorts of authorizations issued under land use plans, and because they've opened the door here, any sort of authorization, even the ones we like, are at risk of somebody suing. So things like special recreation permits or oil and gas leases or renewable energy rights of way or what have you, grazing, all these types of uses are, if anybody doesn't like one thing that somebody's doing, they may have grounds to sue.
Yeah, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more lawsuits about this actually so far. But I think you kind of raised another interesting point for me in that, like this tool isn't necessarily, I guess the CRA as a land management tool isn't necessarily a partisan thing, right? Like, right now the Republicans in Congress are using it to kind of go after their preferred policy outcomes, but you could definitely see a future in which, Democrats retake power in Washington and start going after other authorizations or other resource management plans that they don't like, and that, they might get some wins here. The Republicans got some wins earlier this year, but that kind of chaos in the land management system doesn't really benefit anyone in the long term. At least in my mind, it's, we need stability. Land management is a long-term game. So, yeah, I guess hopefully we can kind of come to a fix for that, which maybe leads me to my next question, which is, what does a legislative fix look like, or is there one, or is there any appetite for one?
Yeah. I mean, TBD on an appetite, but we've seen Congress. I mentioned earlier we've seen Congress enact 7 of these into law now. We're not sure when or if that'll stop, or what else might be in the pipeline. And they've pursued this in sort of a willy-nilly sort of way, where it's like, oh, if there's nothing on the legislative agenda this week, let's just throw CRA on the agenda. It's like, it's easy, and it's something that, like, members will defer to the home state person, and it'll be party line. So, like, I think we're concerned that Congress and the administration aren't taking these seriously, and we really do want to see the Congressional Review Act get fixed in some way. We really do feel like something's been broken here by applying it to land use plans and using it so extensively in that way. A legislative fix could look like something to exempt land use plans from the CRA, or clarify what administrations from both parties believed to be true until 2025, that land use plans and land management decisions aren't rules pursuant to the CRA, something that explicitly states that. That could be a solution. We could also see a solution that could amend the submission requirement under the CRA. While many of these plans that have been finalized since 1996 weren't submitted to Congress, they were published in the Federal Register, which is sent to Congress. So, that's another potential angle to pursue. But ultimately, I don't know that the political will is there to pursue this. I know that there are a lot of folks who are taking it seriously and who are very worried about this. But there are other folks who just want to, not let up and keep the gas pedal deployed and do more of them. So, we'll see what happens there. I know that there are talks about permitting reform. People talk a lot about certainty and needing to, enact legislation to make it easier for folks to, pursue authorizations on federal lands. We at the Wilderness Society think and believe very strongly that, fixing the CRA is the ultimate, sort of the ultimate certainty that businesses need to invest on federal lands. So we'd love to see that as part of those talks too.
Yeah, because anyone that's familiar, I think, with the RMP, planning process, the creation of an RMP, it's obviously something that takes a long time. There's a lot of stakeholder input, a lot of like trying to nail down all these complicated details of like what's going to happen where, how much of this activity do we want in this area. And in theory, it should be like a very collaborative process, right? And so you're basically taking this extensive, complicated, hopefully collaborative document and letting Congress meddle around in it. And I can't think of anyone who would say that, besides maybe a member of Congress, that would say that that's a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many of these plans, even the ones that have been disapproved of in the last, several months, we're the product of years of that type of collaboration and on the ground input and scientific research and tribal consultation. There's so many ingredients that go into these plans. And when it comes to the Congressional Review Act, you don't even need to have a hearing on a CRA resolution. They can be introduced and they can come straight to the floor in both the House and the Senate. And it can happen very quickly. So the implications of enacting these CRAs was never discussed in a committee hearing, something that drives me absolutely bonkers. But yeah, it can be undone. These really careful, long deliberated plans can be undone, and kind of can be undone very quickly by folks in Washington.
Yeah. No, I'm curious, when you're working on these resolutions of disapproval, I'm sure you're talking to members of Congress and their staff about it. What, the ones that support the resolution of disapproval want to vote for it. What do they say about why they want to support it? Does it come down to kind of the specifics of that plan, or do they have like a bigger kind of structural reason for wanting to get Congress involved in that process?
Yeah. So far, it seemed like it's been mostly the former. So more members of Congress having a problem with the outcome and
Hmm.
what ended up happening with the specific resource management plan that was finalized. They've been targeting so far exclusively plans from the Biden administration, some of which were finalized in 2024, one from early 2025, and then a few like dating back to 2022, 2023. But by and large, it's they view them as restrictive when it comes to energy development. That's been kind of the main criticism that we've seen, and that in their view, using the CRA to target them and to delete them would open up more lands for coal and for
Hmm.
oil and gas leasing and for timber production, because whichever plan was in place before that one was a little bit more open to those uses.
Yeah.
We have, we have heard some conversations, mostly from journalists with those members of Congress and their staffs about like, well, what about these implications? What about, could this have implications for other plans, other RMPs that haven't been submitted to Congress? And they've been pretty dismissive of those so far, and have, like I mentioned earlier, kind of a more conservative, narrow view of how the CRA applies.
Sure.
But we're not totally convinced that that's true.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where, you know, if you're right, that's great, but if you're wrong, the consequences could be pretty large. And maybe
Yeah.
I'm wrong about this, but I would imagine, kind of the argument for doing it through this process versus, just rewriting the RMP is just a matter of speed. It's about getting things reopened as quickly as possible in their minds.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And like I mentioned earlier, they've replaced some of the ones that they've undone
Hmm.
with new plans, which is that's kind of that's how it's supposed to work, right? Like if you don't like a plan, you can reopen it
Sure.
and do it through the administrative process and have public comments and tribal consultation pursuant to law. But yeah, you're right. It takes a little bit longer. So um, you know, if they were doing just that, I think we'd be like, well, um, that's they won an election. That's what they get to do.
Hmm.
But this reaching back and deleting plans that they don't like that are well beyond the CRA window is beyond the pale.
Yeah. Well, it's setting up an unproductive kind of tit for tat on it too.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I know you're a busy guy, but anything that we didn't cover that you want to go over on the CRA or otherwise?
Um, yeah, let's see. Nothing more on the CRA. I keep an eye out every day to see if there have been new rules submitted that could be subject to the CRA or new GAO opinions, and it's gotten a little slower, so that's good. But yeah, just hoping that Congress will listen and fix what it broke.
Cool. Well, final question for you. We're all about outdoor recreation here at the Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association. That's kind of why we do it. So, just wondering what your favorite places to go and recreate are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big outdoor runner. So here in DC we have Rock Creek Park, which sort of bisects the city, and it's one of the largest urban parks in the country. And it's more wild than like Central Park in New York. It's got a lot of cool hiking trails. Teddy Roosevelt used to hike there back in the early 1900s when he lived in D.C. So there are a lot of different spots named after him. So it's really cool to go there, go for a run in the morning before everybody's awake. I'd
Nice.
say that's my favorite. And we're also super close to the to Shenandoah National Park, which is also a treasure.
Cool. Yeah, I haven't spent much time back east, so I'll have to check some of those places out. I've heard a lot of good things about Rock Creek Park for sure. All right, Justin Meuse,
Yeah,
thank you so
let me
much
know.
for being
Happy
here.
to give you a tour.
Yeah, thanks for your perspective and
Of
everything.
course. Thanks.
Yeah, keep us posted as this moves forward, and we'll talk to you
Will
soon.
do.
Thanks to Justin Meuse for taking the time to chat with us. And thanks to all the outfitters and guides in Idaho who are in the field working hard and sharing our incredible state. We hope you're having a great season and creating incredible memories for your guests and for yourselves. Please reach out with any questions, comments, or suggestions you have for future episodes. You can email me at Erik, E-R-I-K, at IOGA.org. For you existing members, remember, it's time to renew your membership. So if you don't do it soon, Hardy's probably going to start calling you. Which, I mean, I guess that's an incentive maybe to not do it so that Hardy calls you because you want to chat with him because he's awesome to chat with. But, yeah, we appreciate your support and your membership. If you like this episode, subscribe, tell your guide and outfitter friends. But most importantly, if you're not a member, time to renew. It's supportive members that allow us to continue our efforts advocating for this community. We will see you next week or sometime soon when there's something worth talking about.
Yep. And if you have any complaints, you can send them to me at hardy@ioga.org.
Awesome. All right, Jack, maybe we'll do this in person again, or maybe we'll discover this was a total disaster.
Yep.
All right.
Probably both.
See you soon.